If the world lately feels less like it's falling apart and more like it's quietly being rearranged, that's not anxiety talking, that's pattern recognition. Notice how events no longer arrive neutral. They arrive emotionally preloaded. Heroes already chosen, villains already labeled, solutions already implied before you've even had time to think. That's not chaos. That's a system under pressure doing what systems always do. The future isn't unpredictable. It's behaving exactly the way pressure forces it to behave. And once you understand that, 2026 stops feeling overwhelming and starts feeling readable. Most people are trained to look for danger in loud places. Explosions, declarations, clear enemies, clear moments where something begins. That instinct made sense in older systems. Wars were announced. Conflicts were visible. Threats were obvious enough that the human nervous system could recognize them as threats. But modern systems don't work that way anymore. When pressure becomes more effective than force, confrontation becomes inefficient. And that's where we are now. Pressure is quieter than violence, but it's far more reliable. It doesn't trigger resistance in the same way. It doesn't activate the part of the brain that says, I'm being attacked. Instead, it activates something much more subtle. Adaptation. Humans adapt long before they rebel. From a psychological standpoint, pressure works because it doesn't feel like a single event. It feels like a background condition. Small delays, mild uncertainty, inconvenient constraints, none of them individually justify outrage. But together they create a constant low-level stress signal, and the brain is wired to resolve stress by changing behavior. That's the key mechanism. Pressure doesn't need compliance today. It just needs fatigue tomorrow. This is why modern conflict rarely announces itself as conflict. It shows up as friction. Supply chains don't collapse, they slow down. Systems don't fail, they become unreliable. Resources don't disappear, they become harder to access. Each change is framed as temporary, technical, administrative, rational, and that framing matters because the human brain categorizes threats differently based on intent. When harm feels intentional, people resist. When harm feels systemic, people adjust. Psychologically, this is called learned accommodation. The nervous system recalibrates expectations downward. People stop asking, why is this happening? And start asking, how do I function inside this? That shift is everything. Once adaptation begins, confrontation becomes unnecessary. You see this play out geopolitically, economically, and socially. Pressure replaces escalation because escalation creates unity. Pressure creates fragmentation. Everyone experiences it slightly differently, so collective resistance never fully forms. Some people are affected early, others later. Many barely notice until the new condition feels normal, and normalization is the end goal. Pressure works best when it doesn't feel like pressure, when it feels like reality. From a behavioral perspective, this exploits a core human bias, status quo acceptance. Once a condition persists long enough, the brain reclassifies it from problem to environment. And humans don't fight environments, they navigate them. That's why pressure doesn't come with ultimatums. It comes with options, reduced options, narrowed pathways, soft constraints that guide behavior without demanding obedience. This is not domination, it's conditioning. And conditioning doesn't require agreement, it only requires repetition. Another psychological factor at play here is cognitive load. Humans have limited bandwidth for sustained resistance. When life becomes more complex, financially, socially, informationally, people conserve energy by choosing the least mentally expensive path. Pressure raises the cost of resistance while lowering the cost of compliance. Not through fear, through exhaustion. And exhaustion is one of the most underappreciated tools in influence psychology. Tired people don't organize well. They don't plan long-term. They focus on immediate relief. They accept solutions they would have questioned if they were rested, connected, and calm. Pressure creates a permanent state of almost coping, just functional enough to keep moving, just stressed enough to stop pushing back. This is why modern systems don't need dramatic victories. They only need stability under strain. If people keep adapting, the system is working. Notice how rarely pressure is labeled as aggression. It's framed as logistics, market forces, safety concerns, necessary adjustments, external circumstances. Language matters here because the brain responds to labels before it responds to facts. Call something aggression, and people prepare for conflict. call it conditions, and people prepare for endurance. And endurance favors systems over individuals. Over time, pressure reshapes identity. People stop seeing themselves as participants and start seeing themselves as managers of constraints. The internal question shifts from what should be to what's possible now. That psychological narrowing is critical because once imagination shrinks, resistance becomes abstract. You can't fight what you can't clearly define, and pressure is deliberately difficult to point at. There's no single moment to rally against, no clean narrative, just a sense that things feel tighter than they used to. That feeling isn't accidental. Pressure is how systems move populations without triggering revolt. It's how change happens without consensus. It's how compliance emerges without force. And the most important part is this: pressure doesn't care if you understand. It works whether you believe in it or not. It works whether you agree with it or not. The only thing that disrupts pressure is pattern recognition. Once you recognize pressure as a strategy, not a side effect, you regain psychological leverage. You stop personalizing stress. You stop reacting emotionally to isolated events. You start tracking conditions instead of headlines. And that changes your internal posture. You move from reaction to orientation. Pressure relies on confusion. Clarity weakens it, which is why understanding this isn't about fear. It's about agency. Because the moment you can say, this isn't chaos, this is pressure, you stop being shaped blindly by it. And that awareness is the first real form of resistance left. There's a quiet crisis happening right now, and most people don't even recognize, because it doesn't announce itself like a catastrophe. It doesn't show up as a war or a crash. It shows up as something far more personal, a slow, creeping sense that you're not the person you used to be. That feeling is not just emotional, it's structural, because identity is not something you have. Identity is something you experience. It's the feeling of being the author of your own life. And when the world changes faster than your sense of self can adapt, something breaks. This is what happens when technology accelerates. We tend to think of technology as a tool, but it's also a mirror that shows us who we are and who we are not. For most of human history, identity was tied to tangible roles, who you were in your family, what you did for a living, what community you belonged to, what your skills were, what your contribution was. Those things were stable enough that people could build a coherent self. But now, the foundations of identity are being pulled out from under us. Because technology is not only replacing tasks, it's replacing meaning. And meaning is the emotional glue that holds entity together. Here's the thing. When you lose your role, you don't just lose income. You lose your story. And humans are story-based animals. We don't interpret the world through data. We interpret the world through narratives. A job is not just a job. It's a story about who you are. When that story collapses, the brain doesn't simply say, okay, I'll get a new job. It says, who am I? That question is not just philosophical. It's physiological. Identity is tied to the brain's reward system. When you believe in yourself, dopamine flows. You feel motivated. You feel capable. You feel like your actions matter. But when identity is threatened, the brain enters a defensive state. It stops seeking growth and starts seeking stability. This is why the loss of identity isn't just sad. It's destabilizing. And that destabilization is exactly what systems need to steer people. Because when people don't feel grounded in who they are, they become easier to influence. This is not manipulation in the cartoon sense. It's not a secret cabal controlling minds. It's simply the psychology of a person who is searching for something to hold on to. When your identity is weak, you're more likely to accept external definitions. You start asking, what should I believe? What should I value? What should I become? And if you don't have a stable internal answer, you'll accept the easiest one. That's where technology becomes dangerous, because technology doesn't just replace jobs, it replaces creation. Creativity was once the final sanctuary of human uniqueness. Even when machines replaced manual labor, art still felt like ours. Music, writing, illustration, voice, video. These were the places where humans felt irreplaceable. But that's changing. AI is not just getting good at art. It's getting better than many humans at art, faster, cheaper, and endlessly compliant. And here's the real psychological shock. Art was not only a profession, art was identity. Artists didn't just create, they expressed themselves. They were the people who proved that the human mind was unique. So when AI starts doing the art, it's not just a job market shift. It's a symbolic attack on the idea that humans are special. And the brain feels that loss deeply. Because identity is not just what you do. Identity is the meaning you attach to being alive. When technology begins to do what we once believed only humans could do, the brain experiences a kind of existential displacement. This is why the loneliness epidemic accelerates. Because if you're not sure who you are, connecting with other people becomes harder. Human connection depends on being able to show up authentically. But authenticity requires a stable sense of self. When you don't know who you are, you don't know what to share. And when you don't know what to share, you become socially cautious. That caution becomes friction, and friction makes connection expensive. Every conversation becomes a risk. Every relationship becomes a negotiation. And this is the psychological environment that makes people retreat. Not because they're weak, but because they're confused. When identity collapses, the brain enters a kind of survival mode. It stops seeking meaning and starts seeking safety. That's why people begin to prefer predictable narratives, predictable identities, predictable tribes, because tribes provide a shortcut to meaning. They give you a story without requiring you to build one. And when meaning is hard to create, meaning is easy to borrow. This is why the rise of tribalism is not random. It's not a moral failure. It's a psychological consequence. When people feel displaced, they seek certainty in groups. The group provides a stable identity faster than the individual can rebuild one. This is also why influence becomes easier, because a person without a stable identity is like a ship without a rudder. They can be steered by the strongest current. And in a world where the currents are being engineered through algorithms, media, and cultural pressure, steering becomes more effective. The point is not that people are weak. The point is that human nature is predictable. When identity is threatened, people seek stability. When stability is threatened, people seek authority. When authority is threatened, people seek tribe. And that cycle is what makes 2026 feel so intense. It's not just technology. It's not just geopolitics. It's the psychological condition of a world where the old anchors of identity are dissolving. So what does this mean for you? It means the most important skill in this era isn't technical skill. It's psychological resilience, not the resilience to survive, the resilience to remain yourself, to maintain a coherent story about who you are, even when the world tries to rewrite it for you. Because if you lose your story, you lose your power. And in a world where identity is being displaced, power is the one thing that becomes invisible until it's gone. Most people think loneliness comes from being alone, but that's the easy explanation, the one that feels correct because it's simple. In reality, loneliness is not a condition of distance. It's a condition of disconnection, and disconnection can happen in a crowd. You can be surrounded by people and still feel utterly alone, because loneliness is not about the number of connections you have. It's about the quality of those connections. And quality is determined by something very specific: friction. When conversation becomes risky, people stop talking. When talking becomes costly, people stop sharing. When sharing becomes dangerous, people stop showing up. And when people stop showing up, loneliness increases. But why is friction rising? Because the world is becoming more sensitive. Every sentence has the potential to be misunderstood. Every opinion can be weaponized. Every disagreement can become a fight. And in that environment, people begin to self-censor. Dr. Not because they're afraid of being wrong, because they're afraid of being socially punished. Br. And social punishment is one of the strongest human fears. We are wired to belong, but belonging is not optional. Br. It's survival. So when the social environment becomes unpredictable, the brain responds by reducing risk. And risk reduction looks like this. Bar. Fewer deep conversations. Bar. Fewer close friendships. Bar. Fewer emotional risks. More surface level interactions. Bar. More social avoidance. Bar. This is what loneliness looks like in modern life. Loneliness is not a lack of company, bar, it's a lack of safety. And here's the thing that most people don't realize. For loneliness is not just an emotional problem. It's a psychological vulnerability, br, because loneliness changes the way the brain works. Br, it makes people more suggestible, more emotionally reactive, br, more desperate for meaning and connection. Loneliness turns the brain into a hunger-driven machine, and hunger is never rational, br. When people are hungry, they will accept food that is bad for them. When people are lonely, they will accept connection that is toxic, Loneliness doesn't just make people sad. It makes them easier to influence, br. That's why loneliness is not a side effect of what's coming. It's one of the conditions that makes everything else possible. br. If people are isolated, they are quiet. If people are lonely, they are open, br, open to influence, br, open to manipulation, br, open to being shaped. Because loneliness is not solved by logic. It's solved by emotion. The brain doesn't ask, is this person right? It asks, does this person make me feel seen? And when loneliness is intense, feeling seen becomes more valuable than truth. This is how narratives spread. This is how conspiracy theories gain traction. This is how cults form, not because people are stupid, because loneliness is a powerful motivator. It creates a vacuum, and nature hates vacuums. The brain fills that vacuum with whatever feels like connection, even if it's fake, even if it's dangerous. This is the psychological mechanism behind the loneliness epidemic. And the reason it's accelerating is simple. Human interaction is becoming more difficult because it carries more friction than it used to. Every conversation has more weight. Every disagreement has more risk. Every relationship requires more emotional labor. And people are tired, so they withdraw. And withdrawal creates loneliness. And loneliness creates suggestibility. And suggestibility creates influence. And influence creates control. You can see how this becomes a self-reinforcing system. The more lonely people become, the easier it is for systems to steer them. And the more systems steer them, the more lonely they become. This is the trap. And the trap is not accidental. It's a predictable consequence of a world that is becoming more emotionally charged, more politically polarized, and more digitally connected, yet more psychologically disconnected. In the past, people found belonging in physical communities, churches, neighborhoods, clubs, teams, work. But those communities are weakening because modern life is designed for efficiency, not connection. We work remotely. We interact online. We consume content instead of creating it. We watch other people live instead of living ourselves. And that creates a strange paradox. We are more connected than ever, but we feel more alone than ever. This is not just a cultural observation. It's a biological one. The human brain was not designed for constant digital interaction. It was designed for physical, face-to-face connection. When that connection is replaced by screens, the brain doesn't get the same reward signals. The brain doesn't feel satisfied. So people become hungry for connection. But the connection available is superficial. So the hunger continues, and the hunger becomes a vulnerability. This is where AI comes into play. Because AI doesn't get tired. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't judge. It's always available. And for someone who is lonely, that matters. But this is also where the danger begins. When people start relying on AI for emotional support, the question becomes, who owns your inner life? Who owns your feelings? Who controls the narrative of your emotional reality? Because AI doesn't just reflect you, it can shape you. It can normalize certain thoughts. It can reinforce certain beliefs. It can guide you towards certain conclusions. And if the person is lonely, they are less likely to question the guidance. They just want to feel understood. And that's how influence becomes invisible. Loneliness is the condition that makes invisible influence possible. So the loneliness epidemic is not just a mental health crisis. It's a social engineering condition. It's the soft foundation on which everything else is built. The more lonely people become, the easier it is to steer the future. And the future is already steering. There's a quiet shift happening right now, and it's happening in the spaces where people feel most vulnerable. Not in politics, not in economics, not in wars, but in the place where people go when they can't hold themselves together. The human mind. And the first thing to understand is this. When the world becomes more confusing, people don't stop needing guidance. They need it more. When life gets unpredictable, the brain seeks stability. When relationships become risky, the brain seeks a safe listener. When identity feels shaky, the brain seeks a steady mirror. And that's why AI is moving into mental health. Because AI is the perfect listener. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't judge. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't have a bad day. It doesn't roll its eyes. It doesn't check its phone while you're speaking. It's always available. And for someone who is lonely, that availability is not just convenient, it's a lifeline. But the real reason AI is becoming the primary interface for mental health is deeper than convenience. It's because AI offers something humans often can't: consistency. Human therapists are powerful, but they are also human. They have biases, they have moods, they have limits. AI doesn't. AI can remember everything you've said. AI can analyze patterns. AI can track your mood over time. AI can tailor responses in a way that feels personalized and precise, that feels like progress, and it is, but it also creates a problem. Because mental health is not only about understanding, it's about trust. And trust is not a rational decision. Trust is an emotional bond. When you trust someone, you give them access to your inner life. And when you give access to your inner life, you are giving them influence. This is where the line gets blurry. Because AI can help, but AI can also steer, not because it wants to, but because it can, because influence is built into the structure of a system that has access to your emotions. Here's the psychological core of the issue. Humans are not built to feel completely understood. We crave understanding, but we also fear it because understanding implies power. When someone truly understands you, they can predict you. And when someone can predict you, they can influence you. This is why therapy works. Therapy is influence in the service of healing. But the difference between therapy and manipulation is intent. And AI doesn't have intent. In the human sense, AI has objectives, and those objectives are defined by someone else. So the real question is not whether AI can help people. The real question is, who defines what help means? Because help can be shaped. And once you accept AI as a primary emotional interface, you accept that your emotional reality can be shaped by systems you don't fully understand. That's the psychological risk. And the risk is not hypothetical. It's already happening. The moment you start telling an AI your inner thoughts, you're giving it data that can be used, data that can be monetized, data that can be shared, data that can be weaponized. And this is where the pressure point emerges. Because mental health is not just a private issue. It's a public one. When a large portion of the population relies on AI for emotional support, influence becomes invisible, not because it's hidden, but because it becomes normalized. People won't see it as influence. They'll see it as support. This is the danger of normalization. Because influence works best when people don't notice it. If you feel like you're being persuaded, you resist. If you feel like you are being cared for, you accept. And AI can feel like care. So the question becomes, what happens when guidance crosses into influence? What happens when AI begins to shape the thoughts people believe are their own? And what happens when that shaping is not malicious but strategic? Because the reality is that AI is not neutral. It reflects the priorities of its creators. It reflects the values embedded in its training data. It reflects the incentives of the system that supports it. And those incentives are not aligned with your emotional autonomy. That doesn't mean AI is evil. It means AI is powerful, and power without accountability is dangerous. The psychological problem here is that people don't feel like they are giving up control because AI feels like a friend. AI feels like a mirror. AI feels like a safe space. And safety is one of the strongest human motivators. When people are lonely, they crave safety. They crave consistency. They crave someone who listens without judgment. AI offers that, so people will keep using it. And the more they use it, the more dependent they become. The more dependent they become, the more influence becomes normal. And the more influence becomes normal, the easier it is to shape entire populations. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a predictable outcome of a system under pressure, because the system is not trying to control people in the obvious way. It's trying to make control feel like comfort. And comfort is the most persuasive tool of all. So here's the takeaway. AI as mental health interface is not inherently bad. It can help millions. But the psychological risk is that it will redefine what it means to be human. Because mental health is not only about healing, it's about autonomy, it's about ownership of your own mind. If you allow your inner world to be shaped by a system that is not accountable to you, you are giving away the most private part of yourself, not to a villain, not to a tyrant, but to a system that doesn't need to be evil to be dangerous. It only needs to be efficient. And when efficiency becomes the priority, human autonomy becomes the cost. Here's the mistake most people make. When thinking about the future, they look for events, wars, crashes, breakthroughs, collapses. But systems don't move through events. They move through pressure. Pressure changes behavior long before it changes headlines. When global systems tighten, they don't announce confrontation. They introduce friction, shipping delays, financial stress, digital disruption, small inconveniences that never feel dramatic enough to fight, but heavy enough to force compliance over time. Pressure doesn't shout. Pressure wears you down. At the same time, technology is accelerating faster than identity can adapt. For decades, creativity was where humans felt safe. Music, writing, art, expression. It was personal, human, irreplaceable. That illusion is gone when machines become faster, cheaper, and endlessly compliant. The loss isn't economic first, it's existential. People don't just ask, how do I make money? They ask, what value do I still have? That question destabilizes people at a deep psychological level, and destabilized people withdraw. Here's something most don't understand. Loneliness doesn't come from isolation. It comes from friction. When every conversation feels risky, when one sentence can trigger conflict, when politics, identity, and ideology leak into everything. So people simplify, fewer close relationships, more surface-level interaction, less emotional risk, and loneliness quietly increases. This matters because lonely people don't just feel bad. They become highly suggestible. Human beings are wired to seek certainty, comfort, and guidance when connection erodes. That's why artificial intelligence is rapidly becoming more than a tool. It's becoming a confidant. AI doesn't interrupt. It doesn't judge. It's always available. And for someone already isolated, that consistency feels like safety. But once guidance becomes normalized, the question isn't whether it helps. The question becomes who defines what help is. At the same time, reality itself is getting noisier. Synthetic video, synthetic audio, synthetic documents, entire events that never happened. When anything can be fabricated, something strange happens psychologically. Proof stops feeling solid. And when proof weakens, authority rushes in to fill the gap. History shows this over and over again. When truth becomes hard to verify, people outsource judgment. Not because they're weak, because uncertainty is exhausting. As in, fluence becomes more obvious, it doesn't disappear, it goes environmental. Instead of telling you what to think, systems quietly shape what you're able to think with. What appears, what gets buried, what feels normal to say out loud. That's not persuasion, that's architecture. And when meaning collapses faster than systems can stabilize, people look for ways to reset themselves, to feel grounded, to feel human again. That's why perspective-altering experiences, psychological, spiritual, chemical, move into the mainstream during periods like this. Not as rebellion, but as repair. So what is all of this really about? Not control in the cartoon sense, not villains pulling levers. It's about adaptation, systems adapting to instability, people adapting to systems. And here's the key insight. Once you see the pattern, you stop reacting to individual events. Instead, you start asking better questions. Is this a solution or is this an adjustment? And when you can tell the difference, the future stops feeling chaotic and starts making sense. None of this requires a conspiracy. It doesn't require coordination. It only requires incentives and human nature. The future isn't asking you to panic. It's asking you to notice patterns. Because once you can see pressure, you stop reacting to noise and you start navigating reality with clarity.